Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy. Most people remember that from school. What they forget is that the arsenal was built by the same hands that built their family car. This is not a war story. This is the greatest car story America ever lived. On a cold February morning in 1942, the Ford Dearborn plant stood silent except for the hum of a single line. The last civilian automobile, chassis number 531276, a 1942 Ford Super Deluxe, rolled gently off the end of the conveyor. Its build sheet, stamped and signed, read simply final. The men and women on the floor gathered around, hats in hand, as plant manager Charles H. Wright called out the serial number for the ledger. This was not just a car, it was a farewell to an entire way of life. Just 10 weeks earlier, Americans had woken to headlines that would change everything. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The shockwaves hit Detroit with the force of a hammer. Within days, the Office of Production Management issued its first orders to shut down non-essential car assembly. The War Production Board followed with a directive on February 10th, 1942. Effective immediately, every auto plant would stop making cars for Americans and start building the machines of war. For a country built on horsepower and open roads, the news landed like a punch to the gut. Showrooms that once sparkled with chrome and promise now stood dark, their inventory frozen in time. The Detroit News ran a front-page story, headlined "The Last Ford Civilian Model Set Aside for War Effort." The photo showed the Super Deluxe, untouched, parked beneath a banner that read "Farewell to the Age of the Automobile." Families across America felt the loss. No more new cars, no more Sunday drives in a fresh Cadillac or Packard. Mechanics, line workers, and engineers who once measured their days by the rhythm of fenders and trim now faced a future of uncertainty. For the first time in memory, the Motor City had to imagine life without the car at its center. Yet in that moment, something deeper stirred. The same hands that built the last Ford would soon be asked to build something else. The sacrifice was real and immediate, an entire nation giving up its freedom on wheels, trusting that their loss would forge the arsenal needed to defend the world. The line had stopped, but the story of American resolve was only beginning. The rules arrived in the mail, ration books, coupons, and a new reality spelled out in government ink. On June 1st, 1942, the speed limit across America dropped to 35 miles per hour, not for safety, but to save rubber. Tires once taken for granted became rare as gold. The Office of Price Administration declared that starting October 1st, 1942, civilians would be limited to just 3 new tires per year, and only with proof of absolute need. Most families patched old tubes, swapped spares, or lined up at repair shops that could do little more than mend threadbare tread. Gasoline, too, was no longer a simple purchase. By November, every household received a gas ration book, A, B, or C, each one a verdict on how far you could drive, how often you could visit family, or whether Sunday drives were a thing of the past. The effect rippled through every town and city. Mechanics who once dreamed of opening their own shops now rationed their services, unable to get parts or tires. Dealerships that had filled Main Street windows with polished chrome and promise shuttered at a staggering pace. By the end of 1943, 15% of American dealerships had closed their doors, unable to survive on wartime scraps. For families, the loss was deeply personal. In Cincinnati, the local paper told of the Bumper family who stripped the chrome bumpers off their 1940 Buick, donating the metal to a scrap drive. For 2 years, they walked to work and school, their car sitting idle, its shine dulled, but its purpose transformed. Stories like theirs played out from Ohio to California, as Americans learned to live without the freedom of 4 wheels. Children watched their parents count out gas coupons before every trip. Mothers planned grocery runs with military precision. Fathers tinkered endlessly, coaxing another month from bald tires and worn bearings. The open road, once a symbol of American possibility, narrowed to the length of a ration book page. Yet these sacrifices were not made in bitterness. Across the country, people understood that every gallon saved, Every tire patched, every chrome bumper melted down was another step toward victory. The car, always a symbol of American life, was now a symbol of American resolve. The nation's heart still beat in Detroit steel, even when that steel was parked in driveways waiting for the day it could roll free again. A single order from Washington changed the very purpose of Detroit's machines. On February 10, 1942, the War Production Board sent a directive to every automaker in America. The memo was blunt, without apology. Effective immediately, all plants engaged in the manufacturing of civilian automobiles shall discontinue such production, and shall be converted to war-related production as directed by the War Production Board. No further civilian automobiles shall be assembled, tested, or delivered until the board issues a different directive. There was no room for negotiation, no time for debate. The Motor City's identity was no longer a matter of chrome or horsepower, it was now a matter of survival. Within weeks, the numbers told the story. Securities and Exchange Commission filings revealed that by the end of 1942, nearly 90% of the auto industry's revenue came from government contracts. $12 billion in peacetime sales shrank to just over $1 billion in civilian business. The rest, almost $10 billion, flowed directly from defense orders. Every line item, every paycheck, every bolt and bearing now served a single purpose: to arm the nation and its allies. The rules went further than the assembly line. The War Production Board established joint patent committees, forcing rivals to share their best ideas. Ford stamping dies for bomber wings became blueprints for General Motors and Chrysler. A memo between Ford's Ernest Kanzler and General Motors' Charles Denby, dated March 15, 1942, waived all royalty claims for critical tooling. The only priority was speed. The only reward was victory. In offices where engineers once debated fender curves, they now huddled over blueprints for tank hulls and bomber spars. Patent lawyers became facilitators, not gatekeepers. Tool and die men, machinists, and draftsmen set aside decades of competition. The spirit of the open road gave way to the discipline of shared sacrifice. Detroit's automakers did not volunteer for this transformation. They were commanded to it by a government that understood what was at stake. But the men and women who answered that order, on the floor, in the shops, at the drawing boards, turned compulsion into accomplishment. The American car became the backbone of the arsenal of democracy, not by choice, but by the will of a nation determined to win. A mile of concrete and steel stretched across the Michigan countryside, its roofline barely visible against the horizon. This was Willow Run, the world's largest single-story factory. Built not for sedans or coupes, but for bombers. 80 acres under one roof, 1.5 million square feet of humming machinery, and a workforce that, at its peak, numbered nearly 100,000. Men and women from Detroit and distant farm towns, black and white, shoulder to shoulder, clocked in for 3 daily shifts. Their task? To build the B-24 Liberator, an aircraft so complex it required over 1.5 million individual parts, each one counted, measured, and riveted with the same precision once reserved for a Cadillac fender or a Packard hood. The scale was almost unimaginable. Willow Run's floor ran the length of 16 football fields laid end to end. Raw aluminum entered one end, and at the far side, bombers rolled out, wings gleaming, engines roaring, ready for the sky. The process was pure Detroit, a moving line, jigs and fixtures borrowed from car body shops, overhead conveyors, and a discipline of continuous flow. Every 63 minutes, a completed B-24 rolled off the end of the line. Not a myth, but a number pulled from the Army Air Force's own ledger. A bomber an hour, day and night, for the better part of 3 years. No one on that floor had built an airplane before. Most had never even seen one up close. They learned from blueprints, thick packets of diagrams, each page a new puzzle. Rivet gangs, anonymous and tireless, often led by women like Rose Monroe, moved from hull to wing. their tools clattering in a rhythm that echoed across the vast space. Training schools set up by the University of Michigan and Wayne State turned car mechanics into aircraft technicians in a matter of weeks. Mistakes were made, lessons learned, and the line kept moving. The numbers tell the story. 8,686 of 24 liberators finished at Willow Run, more than any other plant in the world, each one a monument to American speed, skill, and the belief that anything built for the open road could be built for the open sky. For every bomber that soared over Europe or the Pacific, there were thousands of hands behind it. Ordinary people united by duty, who traded the freedom of the highway for the discipline of the assembly line. Their work turned Detroit's heartbreak into America's hope, and proved once and for all what this country could do when it put its mind and its machines to the task. General Motors answered the call with a force and scale that stunned even its own executives. The company's plants, once famous for Cadillac chrome and Chevrolet curves, thundered to life as machine gun foundries and engine works. In Detroit, the Fisher Body Plant, where designers once fussed over the sweep of a fender, became the most efficient gun factory in the world. By war's end, General Motors had turned out over 1 million .30 caliber and 50 caliber machine guns, as well as tens of thousands of aircraft engines, radar sets, and artillery pieces. 2/3 of the company's wartime output bore no resemblance to anything that had ever rolled down a General Motors line before. The men and women who once built convertibles and coupes now forged the tools of liberation, their hands blackened by steel and pride. Chrysler too transformed overnight. The Warren tank arsenal built on the edge of Detroit became a round-the-clock forge for the M4 Sherman. Engineers stripped out the old stamping dies and installed presses that could shape armor plate a foot thick. Tank hulls, 6,200 in all, emerged from the line, each one a rolling fortress destined for North Africa, Normandy, or the Pacific. Chrysler's reach extended further still. Its engineers crafted components for the Manhattan Project, linking Detroit's muscle to the secret heart of the atomic age. The company's commitment was total, its identity remade in steel and secrecy, and then there was the Jeep, the humble, unstoppable Willys MB. Born from a set of blueprints and a desperate need for a go-anywhere vehicle, the Jeep drew on Detroit's genius for simplicity. The car companies pooled engines, axles, and transmissions, building a machine that could cross mud, snow, and shattered roads. Ford alone produced over 280,000 Jeeps, while General Motors and Willys Overland pushed the total to more than 640,000. General Eisenhower himself would later write that America could not have won the war without the Jeep, calling it one of the 3 decisive tools of victory. Each company found its own way to serve, but the result was the same. The factories of Detroit, once rivals in style and sales, became a single engine for freedom. The numbers are staggering. Thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of guns, millions of parts, but the real story lives in the sweat and grit of the workers who made it happen. Their legacy is not just in the machinery of war, but in the belief that American hands, given a purpose, can build anything the world requires. Roswell Monroe's hands gripped the rivet gun, her badge pinned to the front of her coveralls. The sound of her work, sharp, steady, relentless, became the heartbeat of Willow Run. She was 24, a widow with 2 children, and she had never set foot in a factory before the war. But the day she walked onto that mile-long floor, she joined a new American story. Payroll ledgers from the National Archives list her name among thousands, but Monroe's story stands for millions. She learned her trade on the fly, guided by blueprints and the encouragement of women who had been secretaries or shop clerks just months before. In a 1998 oral history, Monroe recalled, "We just kept going because we knew every plane mattered. Every rivet meant someone's son might come home." By 1944, more than 1/3 of the Willow Run workforce were women, up from less than 5% before the war. African American workers too filled jobs once closed to them, their names appearing on shift rosters beside those of white men and women from all over the Midwest. The plant ran 3 shifts, day and night, and the break rooms filled with voices from Kentucky, Alabama, and the city blocks of Detroit. Monroe's photograph standing beside a B-24 wing spar, sleeves rolled, hair tied tied back, became an icon for the American war worker. But the reality was bigger than any poster. The arsenal of democracy ran on the sweat and pride of people who had never dreamed they would build bombers. They were not just numbers or faces in a crowd, they were the hands that turned Detroit into the engine of victory. The numbers behind Detroit's transformation tell a story that no myth can match. Wartime contracts for the auto industry reached $29 billion, more than the total value of all US cars built in the previous decade. That figure represents 1/5 of all Allied war materials, stamped, welded, and shipped from the heart of Michigan. For every tank, jeep, or bomber that crossed the ocean, 3 more rolled out of American factories, for every one produced by Nazi Germany. The factories of Detroit didn't just keep pace, they overwhelmed the enemy with sheer output, outproducing the Axis by a margin of 3-1. This was not a distant, abstract achievement. It was the result of millions of hands and hearts, men and women, black and white, city-born and country-raised, working side by side on the line. By the end of the war, the auto companies had filled $29 billion in government orders, and the numbers only hint at the scale: 1/5 of everything the Allies used to win. But when the fighting stopped, Detroit faced a new challenge, returning to the business of building cars for Americans. 1945 saw just 100,000 civilian vehicles produced, a trickle compared to the flood before the war. Then came the 113-day strike at General Motors, the longest in auto history, as workers demanded a share in the peace they had helped secure. It was a tense, uncertain stretch, but it cleared the way for something new. On April 26, 1949, the first true post-war Ford rolled off the line low and wide with styling and engineering born in the crucible of war. By that year, Detroit's factories were back to building 4 million cars, a testament to the resilience of the American worker and the enduring power of the assembly line. The legacy of wartime mobilization was not just victory abroad, but a rebirth at home, where every new car carried the spirit of sacrifice and the promise of the open road. Beneath the chrome and steel of America's greatest cars, ordinary hands built the freedom generations still drive today. In a moment, families traded style for sacrifice, proving that American spirit runs deeper than horsepower. As new challenges test our unity and ingenuity, the lesson endures. When the call comes, we answer as one. The road to tomorrow is still paved by people like us. Thanks for watching.